When I think back on it, there's a part of me that wonders if things would have been different if I'd just stayed home that night. If I hadn't decided to tag along with the others, if I'd just let it all go and skip the whole thing. But we were all kids, young, stupid, and hungry for something to make life feel like it wasn't just school, weekends, and bad TV shows. We were living in this sleepy little town on the outskirts of Melbourne, Australia. Nothing special, just a quiet place where everyone knew everyone else. But there was this vibe to the place. Something off. Like you could almost feel it in the air, like a storm was always on the horizon but never quite breaking. I never could put my finger on it, but it was there. It started with the rumors. It was one of those things that spread fast, like wildfire among the kids. At first, it seemed harmless, like some weird local tradition that had cropped up out of nowhere. Some of the older kids were talking about this game. They said it was a way to talk to the dead, or, well, a way to see the dead, at least. You didn't even need to believe in ghosts to get caught up in it. The rules were simple. You light a candle, shake this creepy ceramic hand, which, trust me, looked like something out of a bad horror flick, and say the words, "Talk to me." That was it. And when you said those words, the ghost would show up. But here's the thing, the ghost didn't just show up. It would stick around for a while. Long enough to make you question if it was all in your head. And if you were dumb enough to say, "Talk to me," a second time, you could even let it in, let it possess you for a bit. Crazy, right? But at first, it was just a laugh. A dare. Some of the older teens, like Brad and Rachel, said they tried it. They said the ghost was nothing to be scared of. That it was just some feeling, a chill in the air, maybe, or something flickering in the corner of your eye. Nothing to worry about, they said. But it felt like something real to me, even then. We were sitting around at my buddy Greg's house when I first heard the full details. Greg was that kid, everyone liked him, but there was always this hunger in his eyes. He was the one who would push things just a little too far. He was the one who would make you do something dumb just to prove you weren't a scared little kid. "Are you in or what?" Greg asked, holding up the hand like it was the most normal thing in the world. He had this stupid grin on his face, the kind that made you feel like you'd either laugh along or regret it. Rachel and Brad were with him, too, and they were already halfway through their own ritual. The candle was already flickering in the center of the table, casting long shadows on the walls. The room smelled faintly of burning wax, and the quietness of the house felt off somehow, too quiet. Like something was waiting. Watching. I remember just staring at the hand for a second, its glazed, lifeless eyes staring back. I knew deep down that I didn't want to be a part of it. "Come on, Nick, it's not like we're summoning the devil or anything," Rachel said, rolling her eyes. "It's just a game." I didn't say anything, but I could feel the weight of everyone else's eyes on me. Brad smirked, waving his hand in the air like he was tired of waiting. "I'll go first," he said, and before anyone could stop him, he leaned forward, grabbed the hand, and mumbled, "Talk to me." For a second, the candle flickered, nothing major, just a quick little flutter. But it was enough to make my stomach twist. Greg looked at me and shrugged. "See? Nothing to it. Go ahead, Nick. You try it." The way they were looking at me, expecting me to do it too, made my heart start beating faster. I didn't want to be the one who'd chicken out, but part of me still wondered if it was all just some stupid teenage prank. But no. Something about the way the candle flickered. The way the air in the room suddenly felt colder. It felt real. And maybe that's when I should have said no. But I didn't. "Fine," I muttered, grabbing the hand. My fingers were shaking as I whispered the words, almost laughing at myself for being so jumpy. "Talk to me." The second I said it, the temperature in the room dropped. I could feel it in my bones, like ice crawling up my spine. I glanced at the others, Brad, Rachel, and Greg, but they weren't looking at me. They were staring at the table, wide-eyed, their mouths slightly open like they were frozen in place. Then I heard it. A whisper. Soft, like a breath on the back of my neck. "Talk to me." I spun around, but no one was behind me. I dropped the hand. My heart was hammering in my chest. I couldn't speak. Greg was the first to snap out of it, laughing nervously. See? Told you it wasn't real. Just your imagination, Nick. But I didn't laugh with him. I couldn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. That something had spoken. Something that wasn't human. And that was just the beginning. I should have known right then. The way Greg, Rachel, and Brad brushed it off like it was nothing. I should have known that it wasn't going to stay that way. But I was a kid, and I wanted to believe it was just some dumb game. After all, who wouldn't? It's not like people around here believed in ghosts. Not really. Not the way it mattered. But there was something about that night, something that didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the cold that crept in so fast, or the way the air smelled stale the second I let go of that damn ceramic hand. Whatever it was, I didn't sleep that night. Not much, anyway. The next day at school, everyone was talking about it. Greg and Rachel were joking around like it was the best prank ever. Even Brad, who'd been a little quiet after we played the game, was laughing. But me? I felt different. Like I was on edge, watching every corner, every shadow. And then, 2 days later, it happened. Greg started acting weird. At first, I thought it was just stress. We were all stressed, dealing with school, sports, our parents, stuff like that. But Greg didn't seem like his usual self anymore. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were sunken, and when he talked, his voice didn't sound right. It was too low. Too hollow. We were hanging out in my backyard, the usual spot, when Greg asked, "Hey guys. Anyone else hear it?" Rachel, who had always been the skeptical one, raised an eyebrow. "Hear what, Greg?" Greg paused, staring at the ground. "The whispers." Brad laughed, but there was an edge to it. "Man, you sure you're not hearing things? You've been acting all strange lately." Greg didn't answer. Instead, he stood up abruptly and walked to the corner of the yard. He looked over his shoulder, his eyes wide, like he was searching for something, or someone, just out of sight. Then, he muttered under his breath, "It's always there. Watching me." Rachel and Brad exchanged glances, but I was too busy watching Greg, feeling that sick feeling in my stomach again. My mind raced back to that night. The game. The ghost. It wasn't a joke anymore. Not for Greg. The next few days were a blur of strange behavior. Greg wouldn't talk much. When he did, it wasn't like him at all. He would mutter things about being watched, or hearing voices, and sometimes he'd just stare off into the distance with this blank look on his face, like he wasn't really there. I couldn't understand it. And that's when things started getting really bad. It was late one night when I got the call. It was from Rachel. "You need to come to the hospital," she said, her voice shaky. It's Greg. He's not well, Nick. Something's wrong with him." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my jacket and rushed out the door, my heart pounding. When I got to the hospital, I found Rachel and Brad sitting in the waiting area, looking like they hadn't slept in days either. They didn't say anything when I walked in. They just stared at me, eyes wide and hollow, like they'd seen something they couldn't explain. "Is he okay?" I asked, already dreading the answer. Brad ran a hand through his hair. "The doctors don't know. They think it's schizophrenia. But I don't know. I don't think it's that." "What do you mean?" I said, my stomach twisting. "What happened to him?" Rachel shook her head. "I don't know, Nick. One minute he was fine. The next, he was talking about things that don't make sense. He started saying that the ghost, that it was inside him. That it wanted him." I felt my throat tighten. "You mean the game?" Rachel nodded, her eyes tearing up. "Yeah. But it's more than that. He said it wouldn't let him go. That it wanted him forever." I stood there, frozen, trying to piece it all together. Schizophrenia? Maybe that's what the doctors said. Maybe they had to say something, right? It was easier than telling the truth. that Greg wasn't just sick. He was trapped. The next few days were a blur of doctor visits and hospital rooms. Greg was hooked up to machines, but it didn't feel like it was him in that bed anymore. He'd lost weight. His skin was pale, almost translucent. And his eyes were different. Like they weren't his at all. They were glassy, unfocused, like he was looking right through me. But the worst part was his voice. When he spoke, it wasn't Greg's voice. It was this other voice. A whisper. Low. Croaky. "You shouldn't have played the game, Nick," it said one night when I sat by his bed, holding his hand. "You shouldn't have said it. Now it's too late." I pulled my hand away, but it didn't matter. His grip tightened, his fingers digging into mine with unnatural strength. I tried to call for help, but the room felt heavy. Like the walls were closing in on me. "Greg, let go! Please!" He smiled, or at least it looked like a smile. But it wasn't his. It wasn't human. And then, just like that, his grip went slack. The whispering stopped. The room felt quieter. Too quiet. I didn't know what to think. The doctors said it was just mental illness. That it was just schizophrenia. Maybe something triggered it. Maybe he'd been dealing with it for a while. But I knew better. I knew exactly what was happening. Greg wasn't sick. He was being taken. It didn't take long for everyone else to start writing it off. The doctors kept saying it was just schizophrenia. It's all in his head. They told us over and over. But I knew better. The way Greg would freeze in the middle of a sentence, his eyes going blank, like someone else had just slipped inside his skin. The whispers, oh God, the whispers that no one else seemed to hear. It wasn't just his mind unraveling. It was something else. Every day I went to see him, it felt like he was slipping further away. It wasn't the way you'd expect someone with schizophrenia to act. His mind wasn't broken, it was like it was being overwritten. Greg wasn't Greg anymore. The ghost, the one from the game, was getting to him. Little by little, it was claiming him piece by piece. One night I couldn't sleep. I was restless, thinking about everything, about how everything had changed so fast. The ghost wasn't just some creepy game. It wasn't a joke or a story. It was real. And I had a horrible feeling it wasn't done with Greg. The books I'd found mentioned something, a way to sever the connection. A way to break the ghost's hold, but it was risky. Dangerous. If I didn't do it right, if I made one wrong move, I could end up just like Greg, trapped. But I had no choice. It was him or me. I grabbed the candle from the nightstand and lit it, the flickering light casting long, sharp shadows across the room. The ceramic hand was still sitting on the edge of Greg's bed. I reached for it, my fingers trembling, but I knew I had to do it. I whispered, "Talk to me." The room seemed to shake. The whispers grew louder, like a storm breaking, swirling all around me. The shadow twisted and grew, forming into something more solid, something hungry. I could feel its presence pressing against me, suffocating me. "Talk to me," it repeated, this time in Greg's voice. "Come closer." But I wasn't going to let it win. I wasn't going to let it take anyone else. I forced myself to stay calm, to focus. The only way to break the curse, to sever the bond, was to challenge it, to take the ghost's power away from Greg. I had to be stronger than it, stronger than my fear. "Not like this," I said louder now, my voice shaking with fear and anger. "You don't own him. You don't own any of us." The shadow seemed to hesitate, like it was confused by my defiance. It shrank back for a moment, flickering, like a candle about to go out. And that's when I saw it, the way to end it. The hand. I picked it up, feeling its cold, unyielding grip in my hand, and slammed it down on the bed. The shadow recoiled, shrieking, the voices rising in a maddened cacophony. The hand was the key. The ghost had been tied to it, bound by it. And now, with everything I had left, I used it to cut the connection. "Leave him!" I shouted, and with everything I could muster, I slammed the hand down again. For a moment, everything was still. Then Greg gasped. His body jerked, and for a second, I thought I'd lost him. But then his eyes blinked, normal. His eyes. Not the dark, hollow ones. His real eyes. "Nick," he whispered, his voice hoarse. What happened?" I grabbed his hand, pulling him up. "You're okay," I said, breathless, half in disbelief. "You're okay, Greg. It's over. You're free." But it wasn't over. Not really. As Greg came to his senses, I felt a chill in the air. I turned around, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, except for the hand. It was gone. And that was the last time I ever saw it. A few weeks passed, and Greg seemed to be okay. He was different, but alive. He was him again, not just a shell, not a puppet. But every now and then, I'd catch him looking over his shoulder, like he was expecting something. And sometimes, late at night, I'd hear the faintest whisper, just a breath on the wind. "Talk to me." Maybe it was over. Maybe not. Maybe it had moved on. But one thing I knew for sure, whatever happened, wherever it went, it wasn't done with us. Not yet. And maybe, just maybe, it was still waiting for someone else to say those words. I remember the day my grandmother died as if it were yesterday. It wasn't sudden, but it wasn't peaceful either. She had been sick for a long time, too long to pretend that she would just get better. The doctors told us that it was just her time. But no one had prepared me for what would happen to my grandfather after her death. Grandpa was always a quiet person. He never spoke much, even when my grandmother was alive. I think he found peace in silence. Or maybe he just had nothing to say. But after she passed away, he stopped talking altogether. He just fell silent. It was as if his whole essence had gone with her, leaving behind nothing but an empty shell. The doctors called it post-traumatic stress disorder. They said it was the kind of grief that made him withdraw into himself, and that he might never speak again. But deep down I always felt it was something more. I never believed in these clinical explanations. People, especially old people, stop talking not just because of a diagnosis. They stop talking because there is something deeper inside them, something they cannot let out. At first, we tried to be patient with him. My mom, aunt, and I took turns visiting him every day, bringing him food, checking on him, making sure he was okay. But every time I saw him, I felt a little further away from him. There was no longer the same sparkle in my grandfather's eyes as before. His gaze was always distant, as if he didn't see us, but just looked through us. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his cup, and his once strong figure began to wither into something unrecognizable. He was becoming empty. The strangest thing happened the last time I visited him. I had just returned from college, so I hadn't seen him for a few weeks. I walked into his house, our old family home, and immediately felt that something was wrong. The air was thick, as if holding its breath. The house had always smelled like wood and old books, but now it seemed colder, almost sterile. Grandpa was sitting in his chair, the same one by the window where he always sat when Grandma was still alive. The house was eerily quiet, too quiet. I tried to call him, but he didn't respond. Not that he had been responding much lately. But there was something about the way he was sitting there, so calm, that made me worry. I went over to him and for the first time noticed something strange. He was looking at his grandmother's portrait. The one that hung in the living room, where she was smiling, with a soft glow of light around her face. For some reason, I was confused by the fact that my grandfather was looking at it so intently. He had never paid much attention to this portrait before. It just hung there like a piece of furniture. But now he was fixated on it. His eyes were fixed on it, unblinking, his lips barely moving. At first I thought he might be muttering to himself, but I wasn't sure. I leaned closer, and then I heard it. He was saying, "Damn family," he whispered so quietly that I almost didn't hear him at first. always standing in my way. All of you never gave me peace. Never let her rest. My blood ran cold. Grandpa hadn't said a word for months. I could hardly remember the last time he had said anything at all. But here he was, muttering to himself, looking at my grandmother's portrait as if it were the only thing that mattered. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. What was happening to him? It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. It wasn't like the PTSD the doctors told us about. PTSD doesn't make you talk like that. PTSD didn't make you look like you were talking to someone who wasn't there. I took a cautious step forward, not sure if I should bother him. But then I heard him say something that made my blood run even colder. You want to get rid of them all, don't you? You're right. You're always right. I'll do it. I'll get rid of them all. I felt a chill run down my spine. Was he talking to Grandma? Had he heard her voice? No, it didn't make sense. Grandma was gone, and Grandpa was talking to her. But the way he said it, so confidently, as if he was talking to someone who was standing right in front of him. I came closer, unable to stop myself. My breath caught in my throat when I saw my grandfather clutching the arms of his chair, his knuckles white with effort. He was trembling, his face distorted in a way I had never seen before. It was as if the very fabric of his being was being torn in two directions. The room was so quiet, so tense, that I felt as if the walls were closing in around me. My eyes drifted back to my grandmother's portrait, and then I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. There was a shadow in the portrait, a dark figure standing behind my grandmother. A figure that shouldn't have been there. It seemed to be watching us, but it wasn't her. It wasn't her. It was something else. Something that didn't belong to her. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the spell, but before I could get the words out, my grandfather looked up at me. And for the first time in months he saw me. His eyes stopped on mine, and there was nothing in them, no recognition, no warmth, just emptiness. Then he spoke again. You are all part of this, too, he said, his voice low, as if he were speaking from somewhere deep inside himself. I should have done this a long time ago. I should have put an end to this. You don't even know what I've been through. What we've all been through. I stepped back, my heart pounding. I didn't understand anything. None of it made sense. Grandpa was not himself anymore. This was not the man who told me stories about the old days, the man who put me to bed at night and made me laugh with his dry sense of humor. This man was not him. And I didn't know if I wanted to know who he had become. The only thing I knew for sure was that I had to get out of there. The feeling in the house was suffocating, like it was filled with something I couldn't name, something dark and wrong. When I turned to leave, I saw my grandfather for the last time. His face, twisted in a grimace, was looking at me with a strange intensity. I swear I saw something flicker in his eyes, something old, something familiar, but it disappeared in an instant. And just like then, the house was silent again. I didn't sleep much that night. In fact, I didn't sleep at all. The air in the house seemed heavy, thick with something I couldn't understand. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the windows seemed like a warning. I convinced myself that it was just my imagination running wild, but deep down I knew it was something else. I tried to put the image of my grandfather's face out of my mind, the way his eyes seemed to pin me to the spot, the way he spoke in a hollow voice. It was unlike anything I had ever heard him say before. And those words, the way he talked about getting rid of everyone, haunted me. He was not just grieving. He was not just lost in his own pain. No, it was deeper than that. Something was pulling him, something dark, something alive. Around midnight I could not stand it. I decided to go back to my grandfather's room. Maybe it was a mistake, but I had to make sure that he was okay. I needed to know if he was still him. I crept down the hall, my footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. The house was quiet, too quiet. The house always had a certain creak that could be heard at night, but tonight it was as if the house itself had fallen asleep, holding its breath, waiting. I stopped at my grandfather's door and listened. For a moment, I thought I heard a soft mumble. Perhaps he was talking to himself again, but this time it sounded different, more insistent, more persistent. My hand hovered over the door handle, but something stopped me. The air around me grew cold, as if the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. Nevertheless, I slowly pushed the door open. Grandpa was sitting in his chair again, just like before. But this time he was not looking at the portrait. He was looking straight ahead, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. His lips were moving, but the words were different than before. They were harder to make out, as if they were spoken through a thick fog. At first I thought I was imagining things, but then I caught one word, and my blood ran cold. No one believes me. I stepped further into the room, my heart pounding in my chest. Grandpa? I whispered. Grandpa, it's me. Are you okay? He did not answer. His eyes remained fixed, but the mumbling continued, getting louder and more frantic. They don't understand. They never understood. They don't see it. I'm not crazy. Not like they say. I will show them. I will make them understand. It was so wrong. Grandpa never talked like that. Never. His voice was thick, low, almost guttural, as if someone else was speaking through him. I took a step forward, my voice trembling. Grandpa, what are you talking about? What do you mean? For the first time, his eyes met mine. They were not the same as before. They were not the eyes I had grown up with. They were empty. Empty of everything. It seemed to me that something had changed in them, something that did not belong to my grandfather. Then, in the same low, hoarse voice, he spoke again, but this time it was different. This time he was direct, as if he was addressing me. I don't want them here. I don't want any of you here. I want peace. I've waited so long, but now it's time. You will all leave. You're all going. My stomach churned. I felt a cold sweat break out on my neck. Grandpa, no. What is happening to you? You're not well, you need help. But before I could finish, the room seemed to change. It wasn't the temperature, it wasn't just a feeling in the air. It was as if the space itself twisted and curved so that my breath caught in my throat. Suddenly I saw her. A shadow hovering just behind my grandfather, almost invisible, but unmistakably there. It was taller than it should be, stretched out at impossible angles. It wasn't just a flicker of light. It was as if the very darkness of the room had gathered into a shape that was watching me, waiting for me to notice it. Grandpa, I whispered, my voice trembling. What is it? What's behind you? He did not answer. His eyes were fixed on me, and his lips curled into a crooked smile. You're not the one I want to talk to, he muttered. I'm talking to her. I've always talked to her. I felt the blood drain from my face. With her? I repeated, my voice a barely audible rasp. Grandma? But my grandfather did not answer. He just kept mumbling to the shadows, as if I wasn't even there. The darkness around him seemed to grow, absorbing the light in the room. The shadow was moving, stretching, and I felt a strange pressure in the airy weight, as if the room was getting smaller as it approached me. Suddenly it became difficult for me to breathe. My chest tightened, and I staggered, gasping for air. Grandpa! I cried out. Please talk to me. Tell me what's going on. But then he slowly turned his head, just enough to look at me out of the corner of his eye. His gaze was filled with a coldness I had never seen before. It's too late, he whispered. You should have left when you had the chance. You shouldn't have come back. Before I could say anything else, the room was completely silent. The shadow disappeared. My grandfather fell into his chair, hanging his head, and for a moment I thought he had fainted. But when I reached out to check on him, I saw his hands, his fingers. They were twitching, as if they were moving on their own. I ran out of the room before I could stop, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding. My head was spinning. I didn't understand what had just happened. Was it just my mind playing a cruel joke on me? Or had my grandfather finally lost his mind? Or was there something else, something much worse at play here? but as I stood in the hallway, trying to calm my breathing, I heard something from the room. A low, hoarse voice, so faint I could barely make it out. "Get rid of them! Get rid of them all!" And in that moment I realized I understood that there was no turning back. I didn't know what to do after that night. My body was still trembling, and images of my grandfather, the shadow, and those mysterious words were spinning in my head. I spent the rest of the night walking around the house, trying to convince myself that it was just a bad dream, a figment of my imagination playing tricks on me in the dark. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something wrong with my grandfather. Something that wasn't just grief or post-traumatic stress disorder. Something much darker, something that had awakened after my grandmother's death. The next morning, I hardly slept, but I made it through the day. I pretended that everything was normal, as if I hadn't witnessed anything unnatural last night. I had breakfast with my mom, we talked about everyday things, but all I could hear in my head was my grandfather's voice. "Get rid of them all. I've been waiting for so long." It was wrong, all of it was wrong. The way my grandfather looked at me with his empty eyes. The way the shadow moved, and how I felt it, as if something was pulling me out of the darkness. Around noon, my mother asked me to run an errand, so I took the opportunity to escape from the house for a while. I needed to get some air. I needed to clear my head. I left the house in a daze, half walking, half stumbling down the street. The whole city seemed quieter than usual, as if even the birds had stopped chirping. I tried to push the thoughts out of my head, but every time I closed my eyes, my grandfather's face came back to me. This strange, twisted smile. Eyes that had no life in them. I felt as if I was being watched, as if someone or something was lurking right in front of my eyes. When I returned home, it was already late in the evening. The sun began to sink below the horizon, casting long shadows on the yard. I walked into the yard and saw that I was being followed. When I went inside the house, I saw my grandfather sitting by the window again, still staring into the fading light. It was eerie how still he was. He did not look at me when I entered. He didn't even acknowledge my presence. His hands were folded in his lap, but his fingers twitched, almost imperceptibly. I swallowed hard and cautiously approached him, not sure if I should speak. But the silence was unbearable. "Grandpa?" I whispered, my voice cracking. But nothing. He didn't answer. I could feel my heart beating faster, each beat louder in my ears. I wanted to reach out to him, but something was holding me back. It was as if some force, cold and oppressive, was pulling me away from him, telling me not to get closer. But then, when I was about to turn around and leave, I saw something I shouldn't have seen. The air around my grandfather was shimmering. It wasn't a play of light, it was more like a distortion of reality itself, as if the space around him was bending and twisting. The shadows in the room were reaching for him, crawling like tendrils of smoke. My blood froze in my veins when I realized that the shadows were not just on the wall, they were moving. "Grandpa," I repeated, stepping back. "What's happening to you?" And then I saw, his eyes were slowly moving toward me, but not like before. His head was not turning. It was as if his eyes were floating on their own, pulled by some invisible force. And when he finally looked at me, I froze. There was nothing there. No recognition. No love. Only this empty, hollow look. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice piercing in the room. "It's too late. She will come, and when she does, there will be no one left." I stepped back, my heart pounding against my ribs. "Who's coming? Grandpa, please tell me what's going on." But my grandfather did not answer. His lips barely moved, but I could hear him whispering words that I couldn't make out. And then, out of nowhere, there was a loud crack, like the sound of wood breaking under pressure. I turned toward the sound, and then I saw that the portrait of my grandmother hanging on the wall had suddenly tilted. The glass shattered, and the frame fell to the floor with a sharp crash. My breath caught in my throat. The face in the portrait, my grandmother's face, was no longer smiling. Her eyes were wide open, and I swear they were looking at me. I took a step back, my body shaking, but I couldn't take my eyes off the image. It was as if my grandmother's face was now alive, looking at me, judging me. Then my grandfather spoke again in such a low voice that it was barely a whisper. But this time his words were not directed at me. They were not even directed at the empty room. It was as if he was talking to someone or something else. She says I have to do it now. I have to do what she's been waiting for. The shadows behind him seemed to swirl and shift again, darker this time, and crept across the floor toward the door. They were as if they were alive, as if they had a mind of their own, moving closer to the exit, blocking it, preventing me from leaving. A low growl sounded in my chest, and I realized that it was not from me, but from my grandfather. His voice grew louder, more distorted, and his body began to shake violently, as if he was fighting something inside of him. His hands gripped the arms of the chair, his knuckles white with effort. "I didn't want to do this," he muttered. "But she said I had to. I wanted to run. I needed to run. But my legs wouldn't listen." The shadows swallowed the room whole, and now I couldn't tell where the walls ended and the darkness began. Suddenly, my grandfather's eyes opened wide. His pupils no longer belonged to him. They were black. Deep black, like holes, empty voids that reached out to something much darker than I could imagine. "I waited too long," he said, his voice barely human. "I've been waiting for her. She's finally here. And I'm going to make sure." Before I could scream, before I could even realize what was happening, the door to the room slammed shut with a deafening roar. And the last thing I heard before the world went black was my grandfather's voice, a low guttural growl, followed by words that still echo in my head. "You will all die, and she will never be alone again." I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but it seemed like an eternity. The house was dead silent, not a single creak, not a single whisper. Only an oppressive silence that seemed to be pressing on me from all sides. The door to my grandfather's room was locked. I didn't hear him move. But I could still feel the tension in the air, as if I was waiting for something. I went back to the hallway, but the shadows, they were different. They were stretching down the corridor, moving like liquid, slowly creeping up on me. My feet were heavy, as if I were walking through thick mud, but I couldn't stop. The darkness was calling me forward. I don't know why, but I couldn't leave. Something inside me, a perverted need or perhaps a terrible curiosity, pulled me back to my grandfather's room. I tried to open the door again, but the handle wouldn't budge. It seemed as if the door was sealed, as if someone didn't want me to enter. My pulse sped up as I pounded my fists on the wood, desperate, scared. "Grandpa!" I shouted. "Please let me in! What's happening to you?" There was no answer. Only the sound of my own panicked breathing. Then the door creaked open by itself. My heart almost stopped. The room was completely dark. The dim light from the corridor barely made it through the thick blackness inside. I walked in, but before I could say anything, I felt it, the same icy presence that lurked at the edge of my senses. A shadow. It was in the room, and it was no longer just a shape. It was something. A presence that filled the air, suffocated, and distorted everything around it. Grandpa was sitting in his chair, in the same place as before. But now he was not just sitting. He was leaning forward. His face was a few centimeters away from Grandma's portrait, and he was looking at it with that scary, empty look. His hands gripped the arms of the chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. And the voice. This voice was not my grandfather's. It was deeper, husky, as if it came from somewhere inside him and from somewhere else. "She is here. She is here, and she is waiting. I did what she asked. Now they will all pay." I stepped back, my stomach twisted with fear. "Grandpa, stop. What are you talking about? Please tell me what's happening to you." But my grandfather did not hear me. Or if he did, he didn't care. His eyes were riveted on the portrait, his mouth was working, and he was mumbling something I couldn't understand. The shadows in the room began to move, reaching for me, forming shapes that vaguely resembled humanoid. I could feel them watching me, approaching, as if they were ready to trap me. Then I realized that it was not just about my grandfather. It was about something much darker, something that was waiting for me. Suddenly the air became colder, colder than I could ever remember. The temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees in an instant, and the cold pierced me like a knife. My teeth chattered uncontrollably, and my legs froze in place. Then, without warning, the shadows in the room rushed forward. I couldn't move. I was pinned to the floor, unable to breathe, unable to scream. The darkness seemed to become heavy, pressing down on me, suffocating me. Before I could say a word, my grandfather's body leaned forward in his chair, his hands flying up to grab my throat. His eyes were no longer just lifeless. They were empty, hollow pits of darkness. And as he squeezed my neck, the last thing I heard come out of his mouth was something I will never forget. "You are my..." I pulled out of my grandfather's arms and ran to my parents. After that, my grandfather lived for 2 more years and also passed away. I consider this moment as the end of my love for my grandfather.